We covered a lot about the reactive approach. There's one other nice feature I want to show you though. Let's add a new area to our form, maybe below the radio buttons here. Here I want to add a new div, and in this div I want to allow the user to dynamically add form controls. Let's say I want to allow the user to add his hobbies. So your hobbies, something like that. Then I'll add a button with some Bootstrap classes button and then maybe button default. Make it of type button, that's important, so that this button doesn't accidentally submit the whole form. And here I'll say add hobby. Now when the user clicks the button, I want to dynamically add a control to my form here. And that's actually super simple to do. Specifically, I want to add this control to an array of controls because I might have multiple hobbies. So I'll add a click listener here on add hobby. Seems like an appropriate name for this method here. And in there again, I want to add controls. So I'll add the method in my TypeScript code on add hobby like this. And now I need to add a new control, type of control to my overall form. I'll name it hobbies because that is what I'll store in there in the end. And as I said, this should be an array because it could be no hobbies or 10 or 100. So the type here is not form control and it is not form group. Instead, it's a form array. Make sure to import this from @AngularForms as well. Now, a form array, of course, holds an array of controls. So you pass an array here to initialize it. In this array, you could already initialize some form controls with new form control, or like I'm doing it here, you leave it empty to not have any hobbies at the beginning. Now, when we click on add hobby, I want to add a new hobby to that array. So here I need to access my form. Now I want to get access to my hobbies array, and I can do this by getting hobbies. It is a control in my overall form in the end. And now I need to tell TypeScript that this is of type form array to not get an error. You rarely have to do this, but here we have to explicitly cast this. So by placing a lower than sign, then form array, so the type, and then a greater than sign, and then placing this in parentheses, we're telling TypeScript this part here actually is a form array, so everything enclosed in these outer parentheses now is treated as form array. So now I can push a new control on this array. If we would have not casted this, we would get an error. So now we can push a new form control there, but I will outsource this to keep this line short. So here the control is created and stored in a constant form control. And the hobby, well, that should be something the user can now enter. So we'll actually create it with no default value. Of course, you could also change this behavior to pass an argument to onAddHobby and then pre-populate it with this value. I want to add a validator though, so this still works because I'm creating a normal form control here. So the required validator seems appropriate because the hobby input should not be empty. And now I can push this control on my array of controls. With this, we're creating is we are able to add controls, but we won't see it. We need to synchronize it with our HTML code. Therefore, on this outer div here, I'll add a directive form array name. So again, you see the pattern. We had form control name to tell Angular that we want to connect the input to a form control. We had form group name to do the same for a form group. And now we have form array name to do the same for an array. So form array name, and the name was hobbies, the name we chose in our TypeScript object. This tells Angular that somewhere in this div our array will live. Now we can use this array here. So I will create a new div with the ID form group for some Bootstrap styling. And here I simply want to have an input which allows the user to enter the actual hobby. So this type text is all right. I now somehow need to loop through all the controls which are in this array. So on my form group here, I will actually add an ng for loop to loop through all my hobby controls. So in my sign up form, that would be my hobbies, which I can get like this, and they're the controls. With that, I can loop through all them. And I also want to extract the index of the current iteration. I will need this to assign this input to one of these dynamically created controls. Because on this input, I of course want to add the form control CSS class. But besides this, very important, I need to add form control name, because we still need to synchronize this input with the dynamically created input. Now, this dynamically created input will not have a name chosen by us, but it is in an array. So the name will simply be the index in this array, which is why I'm retrieving it here. So I can simply bind form control name, and now I will need property binding, because I'm now not passing a string, I'm instead passing this local variable I'm creating here, I, to pass this index. Let's save this and see if this works as expected. If we have a look at our console, no errors. Let's click Add Hobby, and we indeed see a new input, no errors still. Let's check it. It's invalid, this looks good. So if I enter a hobby here, now it becomes valid. And now if I enter the rest here and go to the console and hit Submit, you will see that in the value of this form, we actually now have hobbies, which is an array where we have cooking, and of course we could also add sports, and in this newly submitted form, you would now find that this array of course holds cooking and sports. So this is how you can use a form array with the reactive approach very easily. It's all about synchronizing it in the end, and about knowing that you have to explicitly cast it to make this work. So in the last lectures, we learned a lot about the creation and configuration and usage of our own forms. Now let's use another cool feature we can easily implement when using the reactive approach, adding our own validators. Thus far, we always use the built-in ones, and to be honest, with all the built-in ones, you should be able to cover most of your use cases. But let's say we have some usernames you don't want to allow the user to use. In this case, I'll go to my TypeScript file, and here I'll add a new property, forbidden usernames, for example. And in this array, I'll add Chris and Anna as forbidden usernames, if written like this. So now I want to create my own validator, which checks whether the username the user entered is one of the two usernames specified here. Now, a new validator can be added pretty easily. A validator, in the end, is just a function which gets executed by Angular automatically when it checks the validity of the form control, and it checks that validity whenever you change that control. So a validator is just a function. Let's name it forbidden names. Now, a validator, to work correctly, needs to receive an argument which is the control it should check. So this will be of type form control. A validator also needs to return something for Angular to be able to handle the return value correctly. This something should be a JavaScript object, and now the following notation might look strange. It should have any key, which can be interpreted as a string, and this is just TypeScript syntax for saying, hey, we want to have a key value pair where the key again can be interpreted as a string, which is true for a key in an object in general. More importantly, the value of that key value pair, that should be a Boolean. So this function here should return something like, let's say, an object where we have name is forbidden. This would be the key name, which is interpreted as a string, and it could be true. So this is what this function should return in the end. For example, the message itself, the key name, is up to us. And therefore, we can now add the logic in this function. In our case here, I want to check if the value of the control is part of this forbidden usernames array. So I want to check if this forbidden usernames index of, so if it contains a certain element, and the element is the value of our control we pass here, the control we're checking. If this is the case, I want to return an object where I say name is forbidden, any short error code you want is true. Now in the other case, I want to return null. And now this is important. If validation is successful, you have to pass nothing or null. You should not pass this object with false. This might sound counterintuitive, but that's just how it works. It should be null or you simply omit the return statement. This is how you tell Angular that the form control is valid. Well, and this is all. We created our own form validator or own validator here. Important, it receives the control and it returns this object with an error code and then true, for example, if it is invalid. So now to add this, I will go to my username. And actually, we now want to assign an array of validators. So I'll change this appropriately. And I'll now add a reference to my forbidden names function. Again, don't execute it, only pass a reference. And now if we save this, we get an error. Now this can be a tough one to spot. What's going wrong here? This error has something to do with the way JavaScript handles this. In forbidden names, I'm accessing this here. Now this might look alright because I'm in this class and I access this forbidden usernames. But think about who is calling these forbidden names. We're not calling it from inside this class. Angular will call it when it checks the validity. At this point of time, this will not refer to our class here. So to fix this, I actually need to bind this. The good old JavaScript trick to make sure that this refers to what we want it to refer to. So with this in place, if we now let this recompile, the error is gone. Let's now check the validity of this input here. It is invalid. But if I enter test here, it stays invalid. The reason for this is that right now I'm checking if control value is part of this array. This will return -1 if it is not part. Well, -1 is interpreted as true though. So we need to check if this is not equal to -1. So if this is not equal to -1, that means we did find it. That means it is invalid. So now with this in place, if we go back, inspect this again, and type test here, you see it becomes valid. If I type Anna here, it becomes invalid. So our own validation here is working fine. Now in the next lecture, I will have a look at this strange error code and how we can use that.